And so my parents' generation moved out to the suburbs where I was brought up. Frankly, I hate the suburbs. And so I ran away from the suburbs and I tried to move as far as possible right into the centre of town. And where I live now, we have an increasing population of people who have, of their own free will, moved back into town. But why are they doing that? Why are we doing that? Well, we're doing that because of good planning. Sensible and intelligent planning. And that's the planning that introduced the Clean Air Acts and stopped the centre of town being polluted, to the degree that the centre of towns are now cleaner, less prone to emissions than the outskirts of towns. It's the bypasses that create huge quantities of carbon dioxide and are causing an environment. If you actually measure it in London, it's the North Circular and areas around the North Circular that are the most polluted. And the centre of town has become somewhere clean and where, naturally enough, with a decaying public transport system, which we're all aware of, we suddenly find ourselves thinking, as human beings, why am I travelling for 2.5 hours to get into the centre of London? Why don't I just live there? It looks perfectly habitable to me. But again, there is nothing in any of the government's current plans which takes account of the changes that have happened in our big cities across Britain in the last 20 years. It's actually, like a lot of planning thought, totally retrograde. It's 20 years behind the times. We are moving back into towns. We like the centre of towns. We have a different relationship with cities to the one that the sort of horror of the Victorian city that grew up with the dirt and grime. And as a result, in Manchester, in Leeds, in London, people are moving back into the middle of towns. And so towns, cities like Bradford, in a way, have a mixed use, a mixed future, a sense of balance between the interests of commerce, of business, of education, of culture. And this is where, in a way, we come back to the Bradford One, because it seems to me that what's absolutely vital about the centre of any city is that it is one of the centres for the spiritual refreshment of people, the cultural centre of the city. And that sense of building on the ability of buildings to be recycled in a properly green way, to acknowledge not just the history of the Middle Ages or the history of the 18th century, but also the history of the 20th century, by recognising that many of these buildings are handsome, were built with a sort of imagination that we are never going to be able to reproduce. Of course we must have outlets for the imagination of our own architects. This is not an argument against architecture or development. This is an argument for useful, sensible, intelligent, clever, and quality planning. And what's happening here is that the Bradford One are stepping forward to specifically take advantage of some of this slightly confused legislation that is emerging at the moment. And they will have a future ahead of them, which is to find a use for that building. Now that's complicated and is a difficult task to fulfill, but it's something that is easier to fulfill from passionate people who believe in it than a sort of top-down appointment. It's a brilliant example of ground-up involvement in the urban fabric in which we all live, and as such, it needs to be saluted and congratulated and encouraged.